48 hours. That is all the time an ordinary low-pressure system over the Gulf of Mexico needed to become the most powerful hurricane ever recorded in that ocean's history. On September 21st, 2005, Rita was merely a Category 1 storm drifting through the Florida Strait, and almost no one was paying serious attention yet. But beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, a layer of exceptionally warm water reaching 200 meters deep was waiting. Like an enormous fuel tank, no storm had yet ignited. In just 24 hours, Rita intensified from Category 2 to Category 5, its central pressure dropping to 895 millibars, shattering every previous Gulf of Mexico record. This was the third most intense Atlantic hurricane ever measured in recorded meteorological history, and it was heading in a direct line toward the Texas coastline. Its diameter stretched nearly 900 kilometers, roughly the distance from New York City all the way to Detroit, and that was a single storm. To understand why Rita became so exceptionally dangerous, you need to look at the geography of the southeastern Texas coastline, where the land is almost as flat as a sheet of paper. The Texas coastal plain has no mountains, no hills, no natural barriers of any kind capable of slowing a storm, arriving with wind speeds of 295 kilometers per hour. This coastline was also the beating heart of the American petroleum industry, home to dozens of massive oil refineries concentrated around Port Arthur, Beaumont, and Sabine Pass. On the morning of September 22nd, ordinary residents of Houston and Galveston were still eating breakfast, dropping children at school, and checking their phones to track where the storm was. Galveston, the barrier island sitting directly on the bay, sits less than 3 meters above mean sea level on average, meaning nearly its entire surface area lay within the storm surge danger zone. This was not Galveston's first encounter with this kind of threat, as this same island had been devastated in 1900 by a hurricane that killed 8,000 people, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center in Miami were watching radar screens and seeing something they rarely witnessed: a storm intensifying at a rate that was almost impossible to believe. In the 12 hours spanning September 22nd, the central pressure dropped another 40 millibars, equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane, remaking itself into a monster in the span of a single night. And this is what few people fully grasped at the time. Rita made landfall less than 4 weeks after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, meaning the entire American emergency response system was still struggling through the wreckage. When mandatory evacuation orders were issued on September 22nd, 3 million people began leaving the Texas coast simultaneously, the largest peacetime evacuation in American history up to that point. 3 million people, a number larger than the entire population of Chicago, all simultaneously trying to escape a coastline served by a highway network designed for ordinary, daily traffic volumes. A drive that normally took 45 minutes from Galveston to Houston stretched to 12 hours, then 16, then 20, while fuel gauges dropped to empty on the highway with no relief in sight. Amid that chaos, a bus carrying elderly evacuees from Houston caught fire on the highway, killing 23 passengers, a tragedy that unfolded in the hours before the storm even made landfall. The Texas coastline stood empty and waiting, coastal roads silent, windows boarded with plywood, and offshore, an unbroken white wall of cloud advancing without pause toward shore. At 3:30 in the morning, on September 24th, 2005, Rita made landfall at Sabine Pass on the Texas-Louisiana border with sustained wind speeds of 180 kilometers per hour. The first thing to arrive was not the wind, but the water, a storm surge wall 3 to 5 meters high, flooding southeastern Texas shores before the eye wall even touched land. A storm surge is nothing like an ordinary wave. It does not arrive and retreat, it arrives and remains, flooding inland for dozens of kilometers over hours of continuous inundation. The communities of Johnson's Bayou and Holly Beach in Louisiana were among the first to disappear. Their Gulf Coast wooden stilt houses swept completely from their foundations within minutes of surge arrival. Imagine this not as houses being damaged, not as roofs being blown off, but as entire villages reduced to bare concrete slabs with nothing left standing above foundation level after the water retreated. Storm surge penetrated up to 30 kilometers inland in the lowest-lying areas of Louisiana, submerging marshlands, pastures, and rural roads beneath brown, sediment-laden water. Simultaneously, the wind was doing its own work across Texas, moving through the pine forests of East Texas like an enormous mowing machine, felling millions of trees in the span of hours. Within a 100-kilometer radius of the landfall point, more than 60% of East Texas forest cover was either completely destroyed or severely damaged in a single night. The energy infrastructure of the entire southeastern Texas region disappeared that night, with nearly 300,000 utility poles knocked down, cutting power to more than 1 million households. And here is the consequence almost no one thought about beforehand. No electricity meant no water pumps, no air conditioning under the September Texas heat, and no means of communication to call for rescue. Central Houston, the fourth largest city in America, lost power across entire districts, its glass skyscrapers reflecting the gray post-storm morning sky in their darkened facades. The petroleum industrial complex of Port Arthur, Beaumont, and Sabine Pass, which together processed nearly 1/4 of all refined gasoline consumed in the United States, shut down completely. Think about what happens when 1/4 of an entire nation's refined fuel supply disappears within 48 hours, immediately after 3 million people have just burned through their tanks evacuating. Gasoline prices spiked across the entire United States within 24 hours of Rita's landfall, as markets reacted to an enormous sudden gap in the national energy supply chain. Back along the Louisiana coastline, the town of Cameron, parish seat of Cameron Parish, had been completely obliterated by storm surge, with not a single structure left standing in the town's center. Cameron Parish had a population of roughly 10,000 people spread across an area comparable to the size of Delaware. But after Rita, most of it had no physical structures left for anyone to return to. This was no longer simply storm damage. This was the literal erasure of a community from the map, in the most precise meaning of that phrase. Simultaneously to the west, Rita's winds and rainfall were devastating interior Texas, causing rivers, including the Sabine, the Neches, and the Trinity, to overflow their banks, flooding areas hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Beaumont, the largest city in Rita's direct impact zone, with more than 110,000 residents, was completely cut off when every single road leading into and out of the city became flooded. No road access, no electricity, no clean water. Beaumont, in the days immediately after the storm, looked like a city that had been severed from the rest of the world. Texas National Guard helicopters began deploying from the early morning of September 24th. But the scale of the disaster zone was so vast that each flight felt like a single drop of water against an ocean. Rita's disaster zone covered more than 100,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of the state of Kentucky, and the vast majority of it had no usable road access. The Motiva refinery at Port Arthur, one of the largest in North America, with a capacity of more than 600,000 barrels of crude oil per day, came to a complete operational standstill. 25 oil refineries and petrochemical facilities along the Gulf Coast shut down within 3 days, and it took weeks for the majority of them to fully restart operations. Meanwhile, those who could not evacuate or had chosen to remain were enduring extreme conditions in the humid Texas heat after the storm. With no electricity, no water, and no means of communication, daytime temperatures across East Texas after the storm ranged from 32 to 37 degrees Celsius, with humidity near 100%, and the absence of air conditioning meant heat stroke was a genuine and immediate threat. This was one of Rita's most devastating ironies. The storm itself did not kill large numbers of people at the moment of landfall, but what it left behind in its wake was profoundly dangerous. Of the 120 deaths officially attributed to Rita, more than half were evacuation-related fatalities rather than direct deaths caused by the storm itself. The storm had done something that few disasters manage. It killed people not only through its direct physical force, but through the cascading chaos of the human response to its threat. Houston's transportation network was designed to serve 4 million people going about their normal daily routines, not 3 million people simultaneously attempting to flee the city within a 24-hour window. Fuel stations along evacuation routes ran dry within the first few hours. Supply trucks could not move through the gridlock, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles ran out of fuel directly on the highway. After the storm dissipated, those who had evacuated faced a problem no one had planned for: how to return home when the roads back were just as gridlocked as the roads out. And when they returned, many discovered their homes had not been damaged by the storm itself, but had been broken into by looters who entered while the neighborhoods stood empty during the evacuation. East Texas's electrical grid was damaged to the point that Entergy Texas estimated it would take 3 to 6 weeks to restore power to all affected customers across the entire region. This was not a few poles knocked down on a single street. This was the entire skeletal structure of the regional power grid torn apart in a literal sense, from massive transmission substations all the way down to final distribution lines. Meanwhile, along the shoreline, engineering teams were beginning to assess damage to hundreds of coastal bridges and roadways that storm surge had either destroyed outright or severely compromised. Sabine Pass and Port Arthur required several weeks just to drain sufficiently to allow specialists to assess petroleum infrastructure damage, as the entire area remained submerged in mud and standing water. Think about what happens to a nation when it simultaneously loses 1/4 of its fuel supply, the electrical grid of a large region, and road access to 1 million of its citizens. That was not merely a regional disaster. It was a profound stress test of the resilience of national infrastructure systems under conditions of extreme simultaneous pressure. In the days after the storm dissipated, thousands of relief teams from across America began converging on East Texas and southwestern Louisiana, but they faced a landscape that was nearly impenetrable. Highways were blocked by fallen timber, bridges were destroyed, and low-lying areas remained flooded, forcing relief teams to spend hours covering distances that normally took minutes. The U.S. military ultimately deployed combat engineering units to clear routes into the most isolated areas, using armored vehicles and military bulldozers to force access. The bayou and canal network of Cameron Parish in Louisiana became a flooded labyrinth in which every building, every road, every familiar boundary marker had completely vanished beneath the water. Local fishermen, the only people capable of navigating their familiar submerged landscape, became indispensable guides for rescue teams with no knowledge of the drowned terrain. In the post-storm darkness, with no electricity, no streetlights, no sound of a functioning city, those who remained in that darkened zone experienced a silence that very few people have ever encountered. The sky over East Texas in those nights was absolutely clear, because for the first time in decades, the light pollution from millions of electric bulbs had completely vanished. But that beautiful sky could not obscure the reality below it. A region larger than several U.S. states combined was in the grip of a full humanitarian crisis. The American Red Cross deployed more than 200,000 volunteers and staff to respond to Rita, a mobilization scale that even the organization acknowledged was approaching the outer limits of its capacity. At the same time, people from the coastal areas were returning to see what remained of their lives, and many of them found nothing recognizable left at all. This is something no damage statistic can capture. Not the physical loss, but the moment when a person stands on the bare concrete slab of the home they lived in their entire life and can no longer recognize where they are. Final economic damage estimates from Rita reached $120 billion US, a figure exceeding the entire annual GDP of many individual nations at that time. The majority of that total came from petroleum industry disruption, but a significant portion came from the homes and businesses of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who never fully recovered. East Texas's electrical grid was ultimately fully restored after 6 weeks, but for many of the coastal communities of Louisiana, genuine reconstruction stretched across years rather than weeks. After the waves and wind retreated, what geologists began documenting was the permanent alteration of the southeastern Louisiana and western Texas shoreline. Rita had cut new inlets through coastal barrier islands, altered the flow paths of bayou channels, and permanently destroyed hundreds of kilometers of coastal wetland that had taken centuries to form. Louisiana's coastal wetlands, already losing roughly 80 square kilometers per year to sea level rise and erosion, lost the equivalent of many normal years of wetland disappearance in just a few hours. Those wetlands were not simply habitat for fish and birds. They were the natural buffer, protecting coastal communities from precisely the kind of storms like Rita that had just destroyed them. Losing wetlands meant future storms would penetrate farther inland with less resistance, creating a dangerous feedback loop between natural disaster and ecological degradation. Economically, Rita's petroleum industry disruption created supply chain shocks lasting months, affecting energy prices and transportation costs across the entire United States and parts of the global economy. The year 2005, with both Katrina and Rita striking within less than 4 weeks of each other, became the most expensive year in American insurance history up to that point. Cameron Parish, in Louisiana, the area most completely obliterated by Rita, would never fully recover its pre-storm population, its headcount remaining significantly lower for many years afterward. This is the kind of loss that never appears in total economic damage figures. The dissolution of community, the scattering of people who knew each other's names and histories across generations. But Rita also left behind something beyond destruction. It left profoundly uncomfortable questions about how the United States prepared for and responded to disasters at this scale. The 3 million person evacuation made unmistakably clear that the highway systems of major coastal cities were fundamentally incapable of handling emergency evacuation demands at their true required scale. The question that followed was this: if this had happened with Rita, which weakened before landfall, what would happen if a Category 5 storm maintained full intensity all the way to the shoreline? And here is the most important fact that most people do not know about Rita. It made landfall at a significantly lower intensity than its peak because it had weakened during the final 24 hours. Rita made landfall as a Category 3 storm with winds of 180 kilometers per hour, not the Category 5 with 295 kilometers per hour it had recorded at peak, and that weakening was Texas's single greatest piece of good fortune. The storm had weakened because its own circulation mixed cold, deep ocean water upward to the surface as it traveled, a natural process that cut off the thermal fuel it was consuming. There is no natural mechanism that guarantees this will always occur, and with rising ocean temperatures, the warm water layer is becoming increasingly deep and increasingly difficult for storms to disrupt. The destruction ended. But Rita's story did not truly end there. Within 1 year of Rita, Texas and Louisiana invested billions of dollars in upgrading contraflow highway systems, allowing all lanes to run in a single outbound direction to dramatically accelerate future evacuations. Oil refineries and petrochemical facilities along the Gulf Coast began systematically elevating critical equipment above maximum expected flood level, costly lesson drawn from pumps and turbines disabled by flooding. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, underwent fundamental restructuring after the dual failures of Katrina and Rita, with new protocols for pre-disaster coordination between federal, state, and local levels. America's hurricane track forecasting system, already strong in 2005, received hundreds of millions of dollars in additional investment, specifically to improve intensity forecast accuracy, because that was exactly what had happened with Rita. Everyone knew the storm was coming and knew how powerful it was, but nobody had accurately forecast the extraordinary speed of its intensification during its most critical phase. Today, scientists at NOAA and hurricane centers worldwide are specifically studying rapid intensification, defined as a storm strengthening by 35 kilometers per hour or more within a 24-hour period. The frequency of rapid intensification events is increasing globally, and scientists link this directly to rising ocean surface temperatures driven by climate change. That means what happened with Rita, from a historic low-pressure reading to Category 5 in 2 days, may be shifting from an extreme exception to something approaching a predictable pattern. Cities like Tampa, New Orleans, Miami, Houston, and Galveston still have millions of people living within the danger footprint of storms identical to Rita, simply waiting for their turn. NOAA's hurricane warning system can now forecast storm tracks with considerably greater accuracy than in 2005, but intensity forecasting remains the single hardest unsolved problem in hurricane meteorology. And it is precisely that gap between what we know and what we do not yet know, where storms like Rita continue to challenge both science and public policy simultaneously. 15 years after Rita, the Cameron Parish coastline still had not fully rebuilt, and scientists argued this was not entirely bad news, since rebuilding there might simply repeat the cycle of vulnerability. The question Rita posed was not only how to rebuild better after a storm, but whether there are places along American and global coastlines where human settlement should no longer continue permanently. That question has no simple answer, because it collides with family memory, with land ownership, with community identity, and with the economic reality of people who have nowhere else to go. The Gulf of Mexico petroleum industry, after rebuilding and hardening following Rita and Katrina, invested billions in emergency shutoff systems and storm-hardened equipment for coastal facilities. The most painful lessons from Rita's evacuation were applied directly to special planning for elderly residents, people with disabilities, and those without personal vehicles in major coastal cities. And each hurricane season that passes, as new storms form over the Gulf of Mexico, meteorologists watch sea surface temperatures with increasing attention, knowing that the conditions for another Rita are present. The 2005 hurricane season remains the most active ever recorded in Atlantic meteorological history, with 28 named storms, so many that the English alphabet ran out of names before the season ended. That is a signal that climate scientists have studied intensively since then, asking whether we are entering an era of more intense and more frequent storms as a direct consequence of a warmer global climate. The answer, according to current data, is not fully clear on frequency, but reasonably clear on intensity. Storms that do form are trending toward reaching higher intensities more rapidly than in previous decades. That is precisely what happened with Rita. An ordinary low-pressure system encountered ideal conditions and became one of the most powerful storms ever measured in record-breaking time. And if that happens again, with larger coastal cities, bigger populations, and more critical energy infrastructure placed along the Gulf of Mexico, the scale of consequences would be categorically different. Houston has grown by nearly 1 million residents since 2005, with many of them living in areas still within storm surge danger zones from a hurricane comparable to Rita. The Atlantic hurricane season opens every year on the 1st of June and closes on the 30th of November. And throughout those 6 months, every low-pressure system forming over the Gulf of Mexico is tracked by meteorologists carrying that question in their minds. 48 hours. That is all the time Rita needed to go from an unremarkable low-pressure system to the third most intense Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. And every hurricane season, the question is no longer whether that can happen again, but when, and who will be standing on the shoreline next time.